I've lived in 3 different houses in my life, 2 with my family, and the one I'm currently in by myself. We stayed in our first house until I turned 16, and then we lived in the second house for the next 6 years before I moved into my own place. This story happened when I was 16 during the last few months of US living in that first house. My family wasn't very close with the neighbors. There were 2 boys who lived next door with their dad, and my brother and I had barely spoken to them, maybe once or twice in our lives, even though we knew their names, Aaron and Tony. One day, my younger brother, who's 4 years younger than me, and I were outside playing basketball in our driveway when Tony came over to talk to us. I don't remember the exact words exchanged, but I do recall the first thing he asked was if we were really moving. Since I was the older one, I did most of the talking. Tony was probably my age, though I never asked him. By the end of the conversation, Tony invited me to go with him and Aaron to shoot BB guns near the creek in the woods the next day. It was a weekend, so I didn't have any plans and agreed. My little brother, at the last minute, asked if he could come along too, though he wasn't sure if he was invited. Tony shrugged and said sure, then went back home. The next day, about an hour before sunset, Aaron and Tony showed up at our door. We quickly answered, since we hadn't told our parents about going out with them to shoot BB guns. Walking down the street with Aaron and Tony dressed in camouflage gear and carrying a big bag of BB guns was strange. They took it so seriously, and my brother and I exchanged looks, trying not to laugh. When we reached the woods, we barely spoke. I got the feeling these 2 were quiet types, which might explain why we hadn't really talked to them before. Tony dropped the bag on the ground and started pulling out the guns, while Aaron snapped a branch off a tree and tossed it into the water. This time, my brother and I didn't find it as funny. Tony handed us 2 BB guns, but then casually mentioned that they were actual firearms. Aaron grabbed a loaded gun from the bag and started shooting at trees across the creek. When it dawned on me that they weren't kidding about the guns being real, I felt a mix of anger and shock. I took the gun from my brother's hands and put both of them back into the bag. I told them we weren't comfortable and needed to leave. Aaron stopped shooting, and both of them gave us a look that was half angry. As we walked away, one of them shouted a curse at us. I always had a feeling those boys weren't good news, and this just confirmed it. I told my brother not to talk to them again while we were still living there. That night at dinner, we told our parents that Aaron and Tony were weird kids, but we didn't bring up the gun incident. That night, I woke up to cold air blowing on my face. My window was wide open. I felt something cold and hard press against the back of my head, and I heard a quiet SH behind me. For some reason, I didn't scream or panic. I just stayed calm. I quickly understood what was happening. I heard Tony's voice whisper in my ear. He warned me that if I ever told anyone, especially his dad, about the guns or what happened that day, he would come back and kill me and my family. I nervously whispered, "Okay." He pushed my head with the barrel of the gun before climbing back out through my window. For the next few months, I'd sometimes spot either Aaron or Tony at one of their windows, staring into my room or my brother's room. Their behavior became more unsettling as our moving day got closer. A week before we moved, a rock was thrown at my window in the middle of the night. I opened it to see Tony aiming a pistol at me. Terrified, I dove to the floor, only to hear both of them laughing hysterically. One of them called me a freaking idiot. There were 2 other times that week when they harassed either me or my brother, and I couldn't have been happier when we finally moved away. After all these years, neither of us ever told anyone about what happened with those boys. All I know is that they were trouble, and it was a good thing we got out when we did. "5 years ago, my neighbor, Mike, though we all call him Michael, told us that his 13-year-old daughter had gone missing. He immediately went to the police, and it was all over the news. My wife and I felt terrible and always offered to help him and his family in any way possible. As the months turned into years without any word from the police, We assumed they had eventually come to terms with the fact that she was likely gone for good. We never had the heart to ask if her body was ever found. Sometimes, Michael and his wife, Sarah, would invite us over for a barbecue during the summer. It was clear that they were never the same since their daughter vanished. Sarah had grown much quieter, almost distant, while Michael seemed more anxious and jumpy. It was understandable, given what they had been through. Fast forward to last week, Michael approached me while I was taking out the trash and asked to borrow a spade. Without thinking much about it, I grabbed my best one and handed it to him without asking what it was for. He thanked me, saying he needed to do some work in the backyard, and promised to return it by the next day. He then hurried back to his yard. I went back inside, and when I glanced out of one of our upstairs windows, I noticed him digging a large hole in his yard. He seemed to be having trouble with it. He's 58 now, after all. I decided to grab another shovel and head over to help. When I called out to him, he looked startled. He dropped my spade and rushed over, telling me, No, it's okay, Rick. I've got it covered. Please, just leave." His reaction was so strange that I asked, "What's wrong?" "It's not a big deal." But he cut me off, saying he wouldn't allow me to help and pointed toward the gate like he wanted me out. I was so caught off guard by his behavior that I left without another word. Back upstairs, I continued watching him from the window. He dug for another half an hour before stopping, looking around nervously at the surrounding houses, and then suddenly noticing me at my window. I quickly moved away, but it was clear he knew I had been watching. That evening, I kept an eye on his backyard, but he didn't continue digging, probably because he knew I had seen him. I assumed he'd wait until nightfall, and I was right. At around 1 a.m., I heard the sound of a spade hitting the dirt outside. It was too dark to see much from the window, so I quietly slipped outside and peeked over the fence. Under the moonlight, I could make out Michael continuing to dig. When he went back inside, I crept into his yard to take a look at the hole. The light from the moon was just enough for me to spot the corner of a black plastic bag sticking out from the dirt at the bottom of the pit. I glanced at his back door and then back at the hole, debating whether or not to investigate further. After a moment of hesitation, I decided to leave, and it was a good thing I did because he came back outside just seconds later. This time, though, he didn't return to digging. He walked to the other side of his house and vanished from sight. I quickly snuck back into my own home and crawled into bed, making sure not to wake up my wife. The next morning, the first thing I did was check out the window. The hole in Michael's yard was completely filled in, and his truck was parked on the street instead of in the driveway. I don't know what happened after I went to bed, but the thought of what might have been in that bag still haunts me. Could it have been his daughter? Did he dig up something he had hidden years ago, only to get rid of it elsewhere? I can't say for sure, but the idea won't leave my mind. I haven't told anyone, not even my wife.
I'm not even sure what to do at this point.
Michael still hasn't returned my spade, and I'm not going to ask for it. In fact, he's been avoiding me ever since, which makes everything feel even more suspicious. Yesterday, something even more unsettling happened. I happened to glance out of my window and caught Michael staring back at me from one of his windows. As soon as he saw me, he quickly pulled the curtain shut. It wasn't even dark out. I don't know what to do anymore, but I'm honestly scared. This happened about 2 weeks ago from when I'm writing this. I've never really liked most of my neighbors. I'm recently out of college, living on my own, but that comes with some downsides. I'm staying in a pretty rundown area, the only place I can afford a house, so I wasn't expecting to have ideal neighbors. On one side, the neighbors are always blasting loud music, and on the other side, the people are the strangest I've ever encountered. There's an older woman in her 60s who lives there, and she's never friendly and seems a bit out of touch. And then there's a younger woman, maybe in her 40s, who has some serious mental issues. I have no clue what their relationship is. Often, I'd be sitting on my front porch and see the older woman holding the younger one back as she had these freak-out episodes. She would cross her arms and rock back and forth, yelling and making strange sounds. Sometimes, she'd even point at me and mutter things to the older woman. It was honestly really unsettling, and some days I'd just go inside when it got too weird. One night, everything seemed normal until I noticed the neighbors were making more noise than usual. The younger woman was screaming and throwing a fit, while the older woman sounded panicked, trying to calm her down. This went on for about an hour, and I'd had enough. I walked over and knocked on their door. The older woman answered and snapped. "What do you want?" I asked as calmly as possible if they could quiet down. She gave me this angry, annoyed look before the younger woman barged into the room, shouting, "How dare you?" over and over. The older woman held her back from coming toward me and slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a second, confused, and then went back to bed, feeling like I hadn't achieved anything. But I noticed the noise had stopped and finally, I could get some sleep. Later that night, I woke up, feeling like I hadn't slept long enough. I glanced at the clock and saw it was only 3 a.m. I laid back down, relieved, but then thought I heard something coming from downstairs. I got up and stood by my bedroom door, listening carefully. When I didn't hear anything else, I went back to bed. But 20 minutes later, I woke up again, still in a dark room. I wasn't sure what woke me up this time, and then I heard it again, a sound. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but didn't turn on the light. I looked around the dark room, trying to spot anyone or anything in there. I checked all the corners, and while it was too dark to see clearly, I didn't think anyone was there. But then I realized the sound was coming from the edge of my bed. I turned toward the noise and saw a black, shadowy figure right by the side of my bed. When I shined my phone's light on it, I saw that it was the younger woman from next door. She was crouched by my bed, staring at me. As soon as the light hit her, she let out a blood-curdling scream like someone who couldn't stand the light. I screamed too. In a panic, I ran toward the door but tripped halfway. I looked back and saw her crawling after me. I scrambled to my feet, slammed the bedroom door behind me, and bolted downstairs. I locked the door that led upstairs and called the police as she pounded on the door, screaming gibberish. When the police arrived, I explained the woman lived next door and had severe mental health issues. The older woman came over after hearing all the noise, begging the officers to let her go. But they insisted on taking her in for at least the night. One of the officers asked if I wanted to press charges, and as he did, the older woman gave me the most menacing look I've ever seen. I decided not to press charges, but her hateful glare didn't change. The police drove the younger woman away, and the older one kept glaring at me as she walked back to her house. A few minutes later, I saw her leave in her car. Both of them still live next door to me. I'm seriously thinking about moving because the older woman clearly despises me, and I've realized that the younger woman isn't just strange. She's dangerous too.